And it is, I'm thrilled, of course, to be tasked with introducing my father, Ron Ghitter, to be making the lunchtime keynote address. He is, of course, the founder of the Dignity Forum and is known to many of you here today. He's the elder from whom I have learned the most. The problem, of course, with introducing him is that he just has too many accomplishments to choose from. So, and I could tell my own stories, but that's not today. I will focus on the human rights parts of his background. So, over the last 45 years, whether through his life as a lawyer, an MLA, a senator, or beyond, he has consistently been dedicated to the advancement of human rights in Alberta and Canada. A very small selection of his contributions include sponsoring the Individual Rights Protection Act as an MLA in the Lougheed years, and of course we've heard a little bit about that already today, and I know that we'll hear more. Chairing the Committee on Tolerance and Understanding that was appointed to examine our education system in light of the Keekstra anti-Semitic teachings. Framing policies as a director of the Schumer Foundation to encourage the government to act forcibly in dealing with human rights. And of course, he's been a recipient of a number of awards for his work in this field, including the Alberta Human Rights Award from the Alberta Human Rights Commission, the Gerald L. Gall Human Rights Award from the John Humphrey Centre for Peace and Human Rights, and of course, the Order of Canada. So with all of this background and history, he truly is uniquely situated to be an advocate for human rights in Alberta. And as we can see, he's showing no signs of letting up. So it's my great privilege to turn it over to my dad.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think the snow came in an inappropriate time. Had I been a weather forecaster, I would have waited a few more days for some bright weather. We were taking pictures a few days ago of Calgary in its beautiful nature with all the leaves and the like, and I got up this morning, looked out the window and saw that snow. It must have come from Edmonton. It couldn't have come from Calgary. So good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. It's so nice to see you all here and the visitors we have that have come. So before I put you to sleep with my remarks, I want to express my gratitude to our distinguished moderators and panelists, some of whom have joined us from Toronto, from Fredericton, from Winnipeg, and yes, even Edmonton. And I also want to extend my gratitude to our directors, our board of advisors, Marissa Hunter, our facilitator, all of whom have made today significant and brought you together. I also want to thank my bank, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, thank you, and Certus Developments, who have contributed to make this day a reality. So I have been asked what prompted us to create the Dignity Forum, a nonprofit charitable corporation. What prompted us to organize this conference, and what prompted us, all of you, to be in attendance this afternoon and to give up your Saturdays and time with your kids and otherwise. I believe we're all here because we're concerned. We're concerned by the alarming growth of racism, stereotyping, violence, prejudice, and bullying that we see in our community, and for that matter, across our marvelous country. We're concerned as we see our mosques and our synagogues under lock and key in fear of violence as their members call for protection from the police. We're concerned when members of our Indigenous communities are faced with the harsh reality of racism in its many harmful forms as they deal with the trauma of the residential schools. We're concerned when Holocaust deniers use Israel as their scapegoat to cloak their anti-Semitism as their rhetoric fills the internet for those who choose to follow the white nationalists as they wave their Nazi flags and glorify Hitler. Yes, we're concerned when our citizens of color face the indignities and fears of being demeaned subtly or otherwise by a predominantly white population who consciously or subconsciously take advantage of their privileged position. And yes, we're concerned when members of our Asian population face abuse arising from the falsity of blaming them for the pandemic. I'm also extremely concerned when I hear our new premier say that the worst discrimination she has ever seen is that experienced by the unvaccinated, and her plan to amend the Human Rights Act to incorporate this concept. Pardon me, could it be that our premier really doesn't know anything about discrimination? So when I read that as we meet here today, there's a conference going in, of all places, the Enoch Cree tribal lands just west of Edmonton, where the UCP convention will be debating a motion aimed at banning the instruction of anti-racism education in Alberta schools, including such things as lectures and teachings and matters of critical race, including diversity and theory. It's shocking to think that that is even being considered in the province of Alberta. It seems that Trumpism has invaded the UC party again. Shocking to see that in our leadership in our province. And so every morning, for those of you that aren't from Calgary, you can go to the corner of Elbow Drive and 4th Street Southwest and elsewhere, other locations in Calgary, I'm told, to see a group of citizens waving placards and blaring with speakers, falsely decrying of all things their lack of freedom and shouting their desire to limit immigration and to have the right to avoid vaccinations. Where are they freer than in any other country than in Canada? Try Russia, try Iran, try China, try Saudi Arabia and others. Where do you have greater freedom than we enjoy than in this country? The mystery is what drives them to be there. What is their true source of their unhappiness? How many Calgarians feel as they do? And human rights, for sure, is hardly on their agenda. At one time in Alberta's history, I thought that we were making reasonable progress in promoting a human rights agenda in our province. Back in 1972, I was there, I'm showing my age, the government of Alberta introduced as their first legislation the Bill of Rights and the Individual Rights Protection Act. Both of these were primacy bills, meaning that the government was bound by their provisions. And this was the first legislation of its kind in Canada. Premier Lougheed at the time expressed the position that the most important commission that he would ever appoint would be the appointment of members to the Alberta Human Rights Commission. His government appointed a distinguished group of diverse citizens as members of the board, chaired by the past president of the University of Alberta, Dr. Max Wyman. A fundamental aspect of the two significant bills that were passed in the Alberta legislature was the basic premise that you can't, by legislation, force someone to love their neighbor. Legislators agreed at the time that enforcement is never the answer, but understood that you can, by advocacy and by education, encourage the creation of standards of acceptable conduct to treat all citizens with respect, with dignity, no matter their religion, no matter their color, their gender, ethnicity, age, or sexual orientation. There are other positive historical examples where human rights have taken the center stage in Alberta. The passing of the Federal Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, the advancement of the Black Lives Matters initiatives, the growing positive activities in support of our Indigenous communities, and an understanding today where we face a whole new approach that is so needed with respect to our people in our Indigenous communities, and that is just starting. We are developing an understanding and an acceptance of the members of our 2S LGBTQ+ community and their rights to love and marry and be recognized and allowed to live their lives in dignity and equity. But while recognizing the positive strides we've taken over the past number of years, I'm sadly of the opinion that today we are moving in the wrong direction, and that the growing of racism, prejudice, and bigotry is once again becoming a significant cancer in our community. We can debate the reasons as to why. The internet, immigration issues, politics, personal grievances, religion, greed, uncertainty, and fear are all components of what is causing us to move, in my view, in the wrong direction. Racism, sadly, has always been with us and will never be fully erased. However, I note as well that it has changed in form and presentation and verbiage than when I first got involved in it. Today, we face a whole new lexicon of unfamiliar terminologies that cloak the growing racism, such as cancel culture, anti-wokeism, white fragility, critical race, and replacement theories. But the characteristics of racism still remain with us. In Alberta, I suggest we have little to be proud of when we examine many aspects of Alberta's history in the advancement and the promotion of human rights. This history is a checkered and often negative story. Some examples. On August 22nd, 1935 was a very significant day. It was to me and my family because that's when I was born. But more important than that, what was significant, that it was the passing on that very day of William Aberhart as the Premier of the province of Alberta. William Aberhart was probably, history would show, the most anti-Semitic Premier that this province has ever experienced. The passing of other areas of bad things that occurred in Alberta was the passing of the Sexual Sterilization Act, where over 4,800 faced the impact of a policy of eugenics in this very province. Then there was the Communal Property Act, which discriminated against our Hutterite population and which said that they had no right to acquire further lands. And then those of you may remember the Darren Lund case, which came out of Red Deer. London, when I first met him, was a principal, I don't know if principal, was a teacher at the Lindsay Thurber High School in Red Deer. He had the audacity to criticize a pastor that was written in the newspaper that he had made some very anti-gay remarks. And Mr. Lund came forward and took him up with it, and what made it public, filed a complaint at the Alberta Human Rights Commission with respect to it, and immediately faced abuse by the followers of the pastor who made those remarks. And it went on for years in dealing with this particular complaint. Eventually, with no support from the Alberta Human Rights Commission, no support from the government of Alberta, and Mr. Lund then went along with it and never really did get a reconciliation of what the abuse that he had taken for having the courage to come forward and say that that is not what we want in Alberta. The other area that you all would be familiar with was the Darwin Vrend case, where a teacher in a private religious school in Edmonton was dismissed once his sexual orientation was exposed. Mr. Vrend, without the support of the Human Rights Commission, again in Alberta, who said they lacked jurisdiction, but gained the support of a group of pro bono lawyers in Edmonton, basically, and he had to go all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada to prove that his discrimination that he had faced. He won the first at a trial level, he lost at the appeal level in Alberta, and then he went to Ottawa. And I happened to be there in Ottawa the day the decision came down, when, to our embarrassment, the lawyers for the province of Alberta came forward and stated in the Supreme Court of Canada that if the province of Alberta wished to discriminate against any identifiable group, they had every right to do so. The Supreme Court of Canada looked down at the lawyer from Alberta and said, sorry, you don't have that right, and unanimously said to the province of Alberta, change your legislation. and bring in a head of sexual orientation to be an act of discrimination in the province. They said, Alberta, you must amend your legislation. Further negatives were on display in our province, none of which make us very proud. When the Premier of Alberta, Premier Klein, opposed gay marriage, to subsequently change his mind when faced by public outrage. And finally, there was the episode of James Keestra, the principal of a school and mayor of the town of Eckville in central Alberta. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that case. Keestra was exposed for teaching anti-Holocaust matters. He was a Holocaust denier. He was an anti-Semite, but he was also the mayor of the town of Eckville. And for years, he went along with that same approach and same curriculum until eventually two parents in Eckville came forward and having seen the material that their kids were bringing home and said, this is inappropriate. So they took it to the Alberta Teachers Association, who did not act on it and looked the other way. Eventually, it came forward, it was exposed, and became a major issue in Alberta. Papers around the world, I saw one from Hong Kong, were talking in terms of what was going on in Alberta, that a Holocaust denier could carry on that long in a public school. That resulted in the creation of something that was spent a lot of my time, I suppose, when we ended up putting together a committee under Premier Lougheed to look in terms of how could it be that in a public school you could have this type of thing occurring. So the Committee on Tolerance and Understanding, as it was called, was put together, in which I had the honor to chair. And so for 18 months, we traveled around Alberta, public hearings, public speeches, meetings, on and on. But it was a real amazing experience to look into what I call the soul of Alberta. We saw all kinds of negative things. We visited many tribal areas. We visited Hutterite colonies. We visited schools in northern Alberta. And we moved around and determined that there were some serious issues that just had to be dealt with within our school system. Believe it or not, we had schools in Alberta that had no basic education. They were just basically what I would call religious indoctrination centers. There's no critical thinking, there's no education. Those schools had no accredited teachers, and they did not follow an accredited curriculum. And so we suggested that we should get rid of those schools, and they were moved out. There is a place for every type of school, but they must have accredited teachers, and they must follow an accredited curriculum. And so in any event, I could go on for a long time on that subject, but that's not why we're here. That's a speech some other time. I'll call you when I'm going to give it. So there are serious gaps in Alberta's commitment in the human rights areas, evidenced by the years of the government of Alberta, in fact, undermining the work of the Human Rights Commission. And you'll hear a lot about that this afternoon with our distinguished panel that will be dealing with the Alberta Human Rights Commission. When I say undermine the influence of the Human Rights Commission, I mean by putting them in the backwater of the Legislative Assembly in Edmonton, by not giving them proper funding, by really ignoring many of the recommendations that came forward to improve it. It seems to me that what happens is the governments don't really like human rights commissions because they'll embarrass government. And as a result, they don't want that out there. And so we'll hear about that more, I'm sure, this afternoon. But there must be action taken to deal with it better, to deal with this bad situation. And then we saw the sloppy way the government of Alberta handled with the chairman that they had appointed, and causing nothing but embarrassment again for the Human Rights Commission, and you all know that story. So it's interesting to note that the governments now are looking in terms of the Human Rights Commissions, and they're looking in terms of what they can do about racism. We now see situations where governments are looking in terms of what they can do and how they can respond in this area. The government of Alberta appointed an anti-racist committee, so-called, to look in terms as to what they could do in this area. They filed a 20-page report that sat on someone's desk, I think, for a year before it came public. The report was full of platitudes, short of a realistic action plan, and certainly was criticized by many for being non-effective. And it's noteworthy to note that in the report that came analyzing what can be done in the province of Alberta, within this report, that there was not one mention of the role to be played by the Alberta Human Rights Commission. Odd, strange, but tells you something of what's happening there. The city of Calgary, during the pandemic, undertook a couple of days of anti-racism discussions and storytelling. And this had some value in providing a venue for important voices to be heard, resulting in the appointment of an anti-racist committee. Some of the members of that committee are here with us today, and they're dedicated and experienced citizens volunteering their time, and they must at times, I think, be frustrated because they have little power, they're surrounded by a restrictive bureaucracy, they're unable to move forward without receiving the blessings of a city council, and they have little money at their disposal. So with the best of intentions, I suggest that these committees become no more than window dressing and cosmetics rather than a true commitment to an action plan. My hope is that I am wrong in those assumptions. So where do we go from here? Why are we here today? And where should we move from? Personally speaking, I find that the world is spinning in the wrong direction. Dictators are unsympathetic to the plights of our minorities, from the United States to Russia to China to Turkey to Venezuela and elsewhere. Where truth is forgotten, history seems to be ignored and manipulated and ignored, walls are built and prejudice and bigotry are shelved and left with inadequate responses, if any. So I, for one, maybe the rest of you are the same, get somewhat worried with the platitudes and wondering about the treadmills that we seem to be on internationally and within our country. So what we do need is we need a public understanding of the gravity of the issue, of the inequities that exist, and of the dangers of ignoring the debilitating aspects of discrimination and prejudice amongst our changing and growing and important populations. This is vital, and what we need to do is to become dedicated to overcoming the tragedies of racism together as in one voice. If we have many groups and many individuals working hard in our community, but their voices become muted because there's too many silos working in different directions. And what we have to do is bring those silos together so we speak more as one, to create pressures upon government and have decisions to be made so that we can face the challenges that we have in front of us. In the long run, as we heard this morning, the education is our hope. Notwithstanding the deniers, seemingly in some in the UCP party, we were favored with an excellent panel of discussion this morning, which provided us with important insights into the role of education. We face many challenges and opportunities by entering into our educational areas, but we need to repair the curriculum. We need to create programs and train speakers to enter our schools. We need to encourage our young to be critical thinkers who understand the inequities and harms inherent in racism and prejudice. And we need to move forward with a Human Rights Commission that is autonomous, that is in there in the interests of Albertans, that can be a spokesperson, not just in enforcement, but in advocacy and in education, and with the government's support behind us. It has been said many times that leadership is so important in this area. You set the standards in your society by the leadership that you create. And as a result, if the leaders, our premiers, are saying this is the approach that should be taken, then the society starts to follow it. If our leaders don't do that and shy away from it for whatever reason, then other things start to happen. And I fear that we've lacked some of the leadership over the past number of years that we very much nice. So let me say in conclusion, as I thank you all for being here this day, that we have challenges in front of us. As far as I'm heartened by the presence here today of representatives from the National Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, and the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights in Edmonton, who are experienced in the matters of education and who hopefully will work with us to further development of school programs in Alberta. So let us leave this conference with the willingness to come together to stop or even slow down the spiral of growing bigotry that is all too evident in our society. Let us today be a continuation of all the efforts of all of us to build a better community in which our citizens experience lives where they can move forward with dignity in an atmosphere of equity, fairness, and acceptance without the discrimination that many experience in so many diverse ways. I assure you that the Dignity Forum has just begun in these efforts and will work in whatever way possible, in whatever arena possible, to make a positive difference in the lives of so many. Thank you very much.